Episode 1. The First Note. The storm came without warning, as if the heavens themselves were angry. Lightning clawed across the sky, illuminating the small village in sharp, fleeting flashes. Amid the torrential rain, a lone figure stumbled along a narrow cobblestone path soaked to the bone. His name was Elias, a wandering scholar with an obsession for lost religious texts, and tonight, he had heard whispers of a church long abandoned, one that had not seen a sermon in over a century. The church appeared suddenly, shrouded in fog, its spire like a skeletal finger pointing accusingly toward the stormy sky. The door creaked open as Elias pushed against it, revealing a cavernous interior drenched in darkness. Candles, long dead, left only faint shadows that danced along the cracked stone walls. The air smelled of damp wood, mildew, and something older, something waiting. Drawn forward, Elias noticed a hymnal lying atop the altar, its leather cover cracked and brittle with age. As he opened it, a single note seemed to hum through the air, vibrating in his chest as if the book itself had a heartbeat. Against every instinct screaming at him to flee, he began to hum along. Just one note, soft, trembling. The air thickened, the shadows stretching unnaturally, leaning toward him. The sound of dripping water became distant, replaced by a low, resonant vibration that seemed to echo from every corner of the church. Then came the sudden, unnerving silence, the kind that presses against your ears and makes your own heartbeat deafening. Elias tried to step back to stop the note, but his voice refused him. It carried on, unnaturally, echoing in the empty pews, mingling with whispers he could not understand. Each echo seemed to draw the light out of the room. Candle flames sputtered and died. The walls themselves seemed to close in, and then, as abruptly as it began, the note ended, and Elias vanished. Outside, the storm raged on, but the village remained unaware. No footprints in the mud, no cry of terror, no echo of a man lost in the night. Inside the church, the hymnal lay closed once again, as if nothing had happened at all. Yet if you listened closely, faintly, just beneath the roar of the storm, a note lingered in the air, soft, inviting, and terrifyingly beautiful. By morning, the villagers would speak in hushed tones of a wandering scholar who had once passed through their village, but no one could remember his face, his name, or even that he had ever existed. All that remained was a whispered warning. Some songs are not meant to be sung, and some notes erase everything they touch. And somewhere in that abandoned church, the hymn waited, patient, hungry, ready for the next voice. Episode 2. Voices in the Choir. Father Marcellus had spent decades guiding the faithful, yet never had he encountered a hymn that whispered in his dreams. Night after night, long after the church doors had closed and the candles burned low, he awoke to a voice, not his own, singing a note that was at once intoxicating and repulsive. It was a melody that clawed at memory, tugging at secrets buried so deep he didn't know they existed. The village choir met for rehearsal in the small chapel, their voices timid and unsure. Marcellus tried to ignore the persistent echo of the hymn that had haunted him for weeks, but the hymn had grown bolder. A low hum filled the rafters before anyone had sung a single word. He looked at the choir members, a dozen faces pale with anticipation, unaware that their fates were already sealed. As the choir lifted their voices in the first hymn, something shifted. Notes bent unnaturally in the air, trembling like a living thing. One by one, the singers faltered. Margaret, the soprano with the sweetest voice, paused mid-phrase, her eyes widening in terror. For a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, and then she was gone. Not collapsed, not screaming, simply gone. A gasp rippled through the room, but it was hollow. No one remembered Margaret ever existed. She had vanished from reality, leaving behind a chair that appeared never to have been sat in. Even her music sheet, carefully tucked into the stand, seemed to have never been touched. Father Marcellus's heart pounded. He tried to lead the choir through another hymn to maintain control, but the melody had other plans. The hymn he had heard in dreams crept into the notes, threading itself into the music, weaving a pattern of erasure. The singers' faces contorted, some whispering names that no one else had heard, others mouthing words that had never existed. One by one, the choir faltered, the shadows around them thickening like ink in water. The stained glass windows refracted their fear, scattering spectral fragments across the walls. Marcellus clutched the lectern, willing the hymn to release them, but it was relentless. It did not sing for them, it sang through them. By the end of rehearsal, only 3 remained: Father Marcellus, Thomas the bass, and little Anna, who had been silent the entire time. The church felt heavier, older somehow, as if every vanished soul had left behind a weight. And in the corners of the chapel, where candlelight failed to reach, faint echoes of voices could still be heard, singing, sighing, and waiting. Father Marcellus realized then, with a chill that cut through his faith, that this hymn was no ordinary song. It was a predator, patient and meticulous, erasing not only flesh but memory, until the world itself forgot who had existed. And somewhere, deep in the shadows of the chapel, the hymn waited for its next choir. Episode 3: The Forgotten Parishioner. By morning, the village seemed untouched by the horrors of the previous night. The sun rose over cobblestone streets, painting them in gold. Yet Father Marcellus felt the chill of unease gnawing at his bones. Margaret, the soprano who had vanished, was gone. Yet the villagers spoke of her as if she had never existed. Not a single memory, not a single photograph, not even a whisper. It was as if she had never breathed in their world. But one man remembered, or thought he did. Jonathan, a quiet blacksmith with hands calloused from years of labor, stood in the square muttering to himself. He spoke of Margaret's laugh, of her bright hair catching sunlight, of the hymn she had sung just hours before her disappearance. Villagers glanced at him uneasily, but no one else seemed to recall Margaret at all. "Jonathan," Father Marcellus said softly, approaching him. "What is it? Are you ill?" They were here," Jonathan whispered, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting shadows to rise from the cobblestones. "The choir. Margaret. She sang." His voice trailed off, swallowed by the memory no one else could share. The priest felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the morning air. The hymn was erasing more than voices. It was erasing lives, and soon, memories too. What terror is greater than vanishing, if even your existence can be wiped clean from the minds of those who knew you? Later, Father Marcellus returned to the church, alone this time, hoping to find a clue, a trace, anything that could explain the nightmare. The hymn lay waiting in the darkened nave, the music sheets fluttering gently as though a breeze had passed. The shadows were long, and they seemed to stretch toward him, eager to whisper secrets not meant for human ears. He opened the hymnal. The notes appeared innocuous at first, elegant lines on fragile parchment. Yet as his eyes lingered, the ink seemed to twist, forming words that were not there before. Names, dates, even accusations, scribbled in a hand that was not his own. And beneath it all, faintly, almost imperceptibly, the echo of Margaret's voice sang once more, carried by the air itself, beckoning him closer. Father Marcellus felt the pull of it, the same irresistible melody that had drawn Elias, Margaret, and the others. He resisted, stepping back. But the hymn had already begun. It whispered of sins unspoken, of guilt unconfessed, of memories that would vanish if ignored. He realized with dawning horror that the villagers were not safe. Each note sung, each voice lifted, risked erasure, not only of themselves, but of anyone who had ever known them. And somewhere, deep within the shadows of the chapel, the hymn waited, patient, hungering, already anticipating the next singer foolish enough to believe they could resist its pull. Jonathan's warnings would go unheard, Margaret's existence would fade entirely, and the hymn would continue silently, waiting for the choir to sing again. Episode 4: Pages of the Damned. The storm had passed, leaving the village washed in pale sunlight that did little to warm the hearts of those who remained. Father Marcellus lingered in the church, staring at the ancient hymnal on the altar, his fingers trembling as he traced the worn edges. Something about the book felt alive, hungry, patient, and disturbingly aware. Curiosity gnawed at him, stronger than fear. He had to know where it had come from, who had written it, and why it erased not just voices, but memories. That afternoon, he ventured into the dust-laden library at the edge of the village, a place long abandoned and forbidden. Shelves bowed under the weight of centuries, and the air smelled of mold and forgotten prayers. There, among faded tomes and brittle scrolls, he found a diary bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed with age. The handwriting was jagged, urgent, almost frantic. It spoke of a sect that had worshipped a silent god of absence, a deity that demanded perfection and punished imperfection by erasing the sinner from existence. The sect had composed the hymn as an offering, a song to invoke the god's mercy, yet simultaneously to grant it horrifying dominion. Marcellus read on, heart pounding. The diary recounted a choir that had sung the hymn centuries ago. Each note was a tether between the living and the vanished. The hymn does not merely erase, the diarist had written. It absorbs the essence of the singer, leaving no echo in the world. Memory bends, and those who knew you forget. Even God forgets. A shiver ran down Marcellus's spine. He closed the diary, but the words clung to him, seeping into his mind like ink bleeding through paper. The church felt different now, heavier, as if the walls themselves were aware that he had learned the truth. Returning to the hymnal, Marcellus noticed something he hadn't before. A faint inscription at the back of the book, barely visible under the dim light. The letters were written in a language he could not read, but the meaning was unmistakable. Sing and be forgotten. The priest tried to resist the pull, but the hymn had begun to hum again, low and insistent. He closed his eyes, telling himself it was only memory, only imagination, but the sound wrapped around him like a serpent, coiling into the deepest corners of his mind. The shadows in the church stretched and twisted as if alive, reaching for him, whispering the names of those already erased. A sudden movement caught his eye. One of the choir's music stands quivered as though something invisible pressed against it. Father Marcellus realized with a sinking horror that the hymn was not bound to the choir. It was bound to anyone who came near it. It was everywhere, in everything, waiting for the next note to be sung, the next voice to vanish. He stumbled back toward the door, clutching the diary, his mind racing. The knowledge was a curse in itself, and yet the hymn's melody, faint and seductive, had already begun to echo in his own throat. One note, just one, and he would join the vanished. The silent God waited, patient, merciless, and the pages of the damned whispered, promising oblivion for anyone foolish enough to listen. Episode 5, Echoes of the Forgotten. By the fifth night, the village had grown silent in ways that were unsettling, unnatural. Streets that once echoed with children's laughter now held only the whisper of wind and the occasional scrape of a shutter in the dark. Father Marcellus wandered through the empty chapel, the hymn's faint resonance curling around his mind like smoke. He had begun to hear them, the vanished, speaking in fragmented echoes that should not exist. It started subtly, a breath behind a pew, a faint footstep across stone floors, a whispered name that trembled in the air. Margaret, Elias. The voices sighed, vanishing before he could respond. At first he thought he was losing his mind, but then he saw it. Shadows moving independently of the light, forming the outlines of people no longer remembered. Phantoms that flickered between reality and erasure. The choir members who remained were restless. Thomas, the bass, had begun muttering to himself, recounting faces and voices no one else could recall. "They're trying to speak," he whispered, eyes wide and hollow. "Trying to tell us something." But each time he pointed or tried to describe them, his words fell into a void. No one else remembered anyone who had vanished. Little Anna, the youngest, trembled as she clutched the edge of the altar. "I hear them," she admitted in a whisper. "They want to sing with me." Marcellus knelt beside her, trying to comfort her. But even he could not deny the strange pull tugging at his chest, a tug to lift his own voice in harmony with the invisible choir. The hymn's power had grown. It no longer waited for a willing singer. It resonated in the air, vibrating in walls, pews, and floorboards. The echoes of the forgotten seemed to gather there, swelling into a chorus of impossibility, voices that belonged to people who had never existed, or had existed too briefly to leave a mark. As Marcellus traced his fingers along the hymn's pages, he saw a horrifying truth. The music itself recorded the vanished, their essence trapped between the lines. The melody of those erased lingered, haunting, unyielding, a reminder that forgetting was not freedom, it was imprisonment. He closed the hymnal, but the echoes persisted. The shadows of the vanished drifted across the walls, whispering fragmented memories that tugged at his conscience. He realized then, with cold clarity, that those who had disappeared were not gone. They were trapped in the hymn itself, forced to relive their erasure over and over. And as he listened, heart hammering, Father Marcellus understood the most terrifying part. The hymn did not just erase voices, it erased connections. Each note severed bonds between the living and the vanished, until the world itself seemed emptier, hollowed of meaning. A single question burned in his mind. When the hymn found its next singer, would he remember to resist, or would he too become an echo of the forgotten, fading from the world while still standing among the living? The shadows waited, the voices whispered, and somewhere, beneath the echoing arches of the chapel, the hymn sang itself, patient and unyielding, hungering for the next note. Episode 6, Confession of Silence. The church smelled of cold stone and forgotten prayers, but tonight it carried a new scent, an almost metallic tang, like blood mixed with wax. Father Marcellus knelt in the dim light of the altar, fingers gripping the hymnal as if it were both shield and chain. The hymn hummed faintly, almost imperceptibly, yet it pulsed in his mind with the rhythm of a heartbeat he could not still. Villagers began to arrive one by one for confessions, but tonight the confessions were different. No one spoke of sins, small or large. Their words were haunted, incomplete. Faces that should have expressed remorse instead twisted in confusion, as though each remembered fragments of a life that had been quietly erased. "Father," a man whispered, voice trembling. "Did we exist before?" Marcellus swallowed hard, a chill creeping down his spine. Even he could feel it, the edges of his own memory fraying, eroded by the hymn's unrelenting pull. Every confession, every whispered plea seemed to ripple outward, shaking loose fragments of reality, twisting the line between what had been and what had never been. The hymn thrummed louder in the pews, invisibly threading itself into every voice, every pause. When one parishioner began to pray aloud, the words faltered mid-air, vanishing before anyone else could hear them. And then, like a cruel mirror of divine judgment, the man simply disappeared. Not from the pew, not from the world, but from memory itself. No one recalled his existence, except Marcellus, who felt the heavy, oppressive guilt of being the sole witness. The priest's hands shook as he held the hymnal tighter. Each page seemed to vibrate with the whispers of the erased, reminding him that even the act of listening came with a cost. The hymn did not forgive. It did not erase evenly or fairly. It punished curiosity, faith, fear, and desire alike. Little Anna approached the confessional, trembling, eyes wide. "Father," she whispered, "they're calling me from the shadows." Her small voice carried a weight far beyond her years. Marcellus tried to reassure her, but words felt hollow, inadequate. He knew she could not be saved simply by prayer. She had already heard the hymn in ways none of them could resist. And then it happened. Another parishioner vanished mid-confession, leaving behind a chair as empty and meaningless as the words he had left unsaid. Marcellus could feel the hymn's eyes on him, patient, waiting for his next step, every heartbeat threatening erasure. Father Marcellus sank to the floor, clutching the hymnal to his chest. Faith, he realized, was no protection. Knowledge offered no shield. The hymn did not care about morality, repentance, or sin. It only cared about voices, about existence, and about the hunger of silence it carried in its notes. In the shadows of the confessional, the erased whispered to one another, a choir of forgotten souls that only he could hear. Their song was beautiful and terrible, full of longing, full of despair, and it carried a single message: resist, and you may remember yourself, but the next note will find you. And somewhere in the chapel, the hymn waited, patient and eternal, for the next confession to end in silence. Episode 7, The Soloist. The village had grown quieter than ever, as if the world itself had begun to hold its breath. In the church, Father Marcellus watched the remaining choir members with a mixture of dread and awe. And then there was him, Lucas, a young soloist whose voice was said to be the purest in the region, untouched by pride or vanity, until now. Lucas had begun hearing the hymn without reason, even in the silence of his own home. At night, it seeped into his dreams. each note curling around his ribs, prying open memories he had never shared. He tried to resist, tried to drown it out with ordinary songs, mundane tunes, anything that would remind him of life outside the chapel. But the hymn was relentless. Tonight he stepped onto the altar alone. The rest of the choir had abandoned rehearsal, fearing the pull they could not resist. Father Marcellus followed cautiously, heart hammering. The hymn began in whispers, weaving through the stone arches like smoke. Lucas's lips trembled as he sang a single note, soft, hesitant, and immediately the world seemed to shiver. The shadows lengthened, candles flickered as if dancing to a rhythm only they could hear. And then he sang again, this time stronger, each note trembling with the weight of unseen eyes. The air thickened, carrying the whispers of those already vanished. Lucas's voice wove through the ghosts of the erased, calling them, summoning them. Father Marcellus wanted to stop him, to pull him away, but his feet were rooted to the floor. The hymn demanded obedience, and even his faith felt powerless against its pull. The walls themselves seemed to hum, vibrating in harmony with Lucas's voice. One by one, fragments of the vanished began to appear, ghostly outlines hovering at the edges of perception, faces unremembered by the living but unmistakable to the ear. Margaret, Elias, and others, silent, pale, and yearning, reached toward Lucas, drawn by the purity of his tone. A tremor ran through Lucas, fear and exhilaration colliding in his chest. He realized he was not singing for the choir, or for Father Marcellus, or even for himself. He was singing for the hymn. Every note granted it power, every pause risked his own erasure, and the more he sang, the more the shadows of the forgotten pressed closer, their whispers curling around his mind, tempting him, urging him to forget everything except the music. Father Marcellus fell to his knees, whispering desperate prayers. The hymn pulsed through the church like a heartbeat, and the young soloist's voice was the lifeblood. He had become the conduit, the bridge between memory and oblivion. And in that moment, Lucas understood a truth that terrified him. The hymn did not merely erase, it collected. It gathered voices, souls, and existence itself, storing them in the resonance of a melody that would never end. One wrong note, one slip of breath, and he would join the forgotten. The soloist sang on. The shadows waited. The hymn hungered, and the church trembled, as though it knew that tonight, history itself would be rewritten in silence. Episode 8, Harmony of Shadows. By the 8th night, the church had changed. The walls, once cold and silent, now seemed to breathe in rhythm with the hymn. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the stone floors, curling like smoke, bending and twisting independently of the light. They whispered, laughed, and sometimes, just for a moment, they mimicked the faces of those who had vanished, offering glimpses of life that no longer existed. Lucas, the young soloist, returned to the altar, drawn by the irresistible call of the hymn. He had become its reluctant servant, his voice a tether between the living and the erased. But tonight, the shadows seemed different. They moved with intent, shifting in patterns he could not predict. As he sang, their forms mirrored his notes, coiling and uncoiling like ink spilled across the chapel floor. Father Marcellus watched from the pews, heart pounding. He had tried to warn Lucas, tried to shield him from the pull of the melody, but even he could not resist its insidious rhythm. The hymn was no longer a simple song. It had become a living force, shaping reality itself, bending light and shadow to its will. One shadow detached from the rest, forming the faint outline of Margaret, her face both familiar and impossible. She reached toward Lucas, lips moving without sound, mouthing the words of the hymn. Another shadow, this one a distorted version of Elias, lurked near the altar, stretching impossibly tall, his arms like twisted branches. Each shadow pulsed with an eerie life, reacting to the music in perfect harmony. Lucas trembled but continued to sing. Every note he released seemed to awaken more shadows, drawing them from the corners of the chapel. They flowed through the air, brushing against the walls, pooling in the corners, forming silent choirs that existed between moments. Each shadow carried a fragment of memory, a flicker of a soul that had been erased, and all of it was bound to the hymn's rhythm. Father Marcellus realized something horrifying. The hymn did not merely erase, it recorded, it preserved. Every soul it had taken existed now as part of the Shadows Symphony, a silent orchestra that played only when Lucas sang. The church was no longer a building. It was a vessel, a stage for the forgotten, and the hymn was its conductor. A sudden chill swept through the chapel, and Lucas faltered. The shadows reacted instantly, writhing violently, as if punishing him. The hymn's melody surged in his mind, compelling him to continue. One wrong note, one hesitation, and he would be the next to vanish, erased from memory and absorbed into the harmony of shadows. Father Marcellus whispered prayers he no longer believed in, feeling the weight of centuries of lost voices pressing down upon him. And as Lucas's voice rose, clear and trembling, the shadows moved in perfect unison, circling, spinning, and waiting, patient, merciless, eternal. Tonight the hymn was no longer just a song. It was an army, a prison, a memory, and the harmony of shadows had claimed its stage. Episode 9, The Forgotten Festival. The village had long celebrated the Harvest Festival, a time of music, laughter, and remembrance. But this year, the festival felt hollow. Streets were lined with lanterns that flickered weakly, as if dimmed by unseen hands. The air carried a strange resonance, a faint echo of the hymn that had begun to claim lives and memories, threading its melody through every corner of the town. Father Marcellus stood at the edge of the square, watching as villagers began to gather, unaware of the invisible terror creeping among them. Some faces seemed off, their features blurred, as if the world itself was forgetting them, even as they laughed. The shadows clung to the corners of the festival, stretching along the cobblestones, whispering names that no one could remember. Lucas, the soloist, had been drawn here, unable to resist the pull of the hymn. His voice carried over the crowd, soft at first, hesitant, like a gentle wind through the lanterns. But the shadows responded instantly, curling around the villagers, brushing against their shoulders, their arms, their hearts. The melody threaded itself through the festivities, turning songs of joy into whispers of oblivion. One by one, people began to vanish. Not with a scream, not with a struggle, but as if the world had blinked and they had never existed. Chairs where families sat moments ago were suddenly empty. Food left on tables remained untouched. Laughter vanished mid-echo, swallowed by the invisible grip of the hymn. And yet, nobody remembered the missing. Their absence left no mark, only a vague feeling of something forgotten. Father Marcellus tried to pull Lucas away, to silence him, but the young soloist's voice was no longer his own. He sang because the hymn demanded it, because the shadows of the erased pressed closer, whispering, urging, threatening. Each note strengthened the invisible chorus. Each pause risked his erasure. Little Anna ran among the surviving villagers, her small voice calling out names that no one else could recall. Elias, Margaret, don't leave me. But the festival had become a labyrinth of forgetting. Even her pleas seemed swallowed by the melody that wrapped the village in its chilling embrace. Marcellus realized with sinking horror that the hymn had grown beyond the church. It had woven itself into the very fabric of the village, and soon it would spread farther. Every song, every chant, every note of music risked becoming a thread in its terrible tapestry. The forgotten were not gone. They were still present, haunting the edges of perception, waiting to claim the next voice foolish enough to remember them. As dusk fell, the festival lights flickered and dimmed. Shadows lengthened, pooling across the cobblestones like ink. Lucas's voice rose to a crescendo, harmonizing with the unseen choir of vanished souls. The villagers, oblivious to the truth, danced and sang, unaware that with every step, every note, they were drawing closer to oblivion. And in the heart of the square, among the flickering lanterns and the silent echoes, the hymn waited, patient and eternal, ready to erase again. Episode 10, Requiem of the Vanished. Night had fallen over the village, but it was not darkness that frightened the few who remained. It was absence. The streets, once bustling with life, were empty, silent, and unnervingly clean. Footsteps echoed where no one walked. Windows reflected faces that were no longer there. The hymn had grown stronger, louder, and the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next note to fall. Father Marcellus walked cautiously through the square, clutching the hymnal to his chest. The weight of it pressed against him, heavier than stone. Every page he turned seemed alive, quivering with anticipation. The diary he had discovered in the library lay open beside him, its words fading and shifting as though the erased were rewriting history in real time. Lucas had disappeared hours ago. His voice, however, remained, a spectral resonance that drifted across the village like fog. Every building, every street, every corner hummed with the faint echoes of the hymn. Marcellus realized with a sickening certainty that the young soloist had become part of the melody itself, trapped and singing eternally for a choir that could not be seen or remembered. He moved toward the church, the only place where he could feel the hymn's pulse directly, like a heartbeat beneath his feet. Shadows stretched along the walls, twisting into grotesque forms, faces of those already erased contorted in silent screams. Margaret, Elias, Thomas. The forgotten were here, trapped in the resonance, unable to rest, their presence both haunting and beautiful. Father Marcellus fell to his knees in the nave. "God," he whispered, though he knew no deity would answer. "What have we done? What have we awakened?" The hymn responded with a swell of invisible chords, vibrating through his chest, each note a knife carving absence into reality. He could hear the village disappearing around him. One by one, memories of people, friends, neighbors, even family, were wiped clean. Chairs sat empty. Food decayed untouched. Children's laughter was gone, replaced by a hollow wind that whispered names only Marcellus remembered. He tried to call out, to save them, but the hymn absorbed every sound, turning it into another thread in its symphony of oblivion. And then he understood. The hymn did not just erase, it judged. It measured the weight of existence and found all wanting. Every note sung was a sentence, every pause a mercy denied. The vanished were not dead, they were eternal, suspended between being and nothingness, prisoners of music that had learned to hunger. Father Marcellus opened the hymnal, trembling, realizing that if he sang, he would join them. If he resisted, he might live. But he could not stop the world from unraveling around him. The church shivered, stone groaning under the weight of centuries of forgotten voices. Outside, the wind carried a faint chorus, the requiem of the vanished, rising, swelling, merging with the silence that had claimed the village. Marcellus knelt, head bowed as the hymn wrapped him in its embrace. One note, just one, would decide everything. And in the shadows, the unseen choir waited, patient and eternal, ready to claim the next voice. Episode 11, The Choir of Nothing. The church was silent, yet the silence was alive. Every stone, every candle, every shadow vibrated with the hymn's presence. Father Marcellus knelt in the nave, sweat beading on his brow, heart hammering in rhythm with an invisible orchestra. The village outside was gone, erased, unremembered, swallowed entirely by the hymn's hunger. And now the final act had begun, the choir of nothing. He could hear it, the absent voices, twisted into a single dreadful harmony. Not just the vanished villagers, not just the choir members who had disappeared one by one, but every soul ever touched by the hymn, trapped in its resonance, singing eternally for no one. It was music without audience, melody without form, a symphony of oblivion. Lucas's voice had become one with the hymn. Father Marcellus could no longer distinguish the boy from the invisible choir. Every note that reached his ears was alive, curling into his mind, tugging at memories he hadn't yet lost. Faces of the erased appeared and vanished in the periphery of his vision, eyes pleading, mouths mouthing silent screams, reaching for him across the void. He rose unsteadily to his feet, glancing at the hymnal on the altar. It seemed to pulse with life, the ink writhing like a living thing. One page turned itself, revealing notation that had not existed moments before. The hymn had learned, adapted, and grown beyond the boundaries of the book. It no longer required singers. It could call upon the world itself, bending reality to its will. Father Marcellus felt the pull. The hymn wanted him to sing, wanted him to join the choir of nothing, to become another voice in its eternal, hollow symphony. He staggered back, trying to resist, but the shadows whispered, curling around his legs, tugging, demanding. The absent faces reached for him, hands like smoke, longing for the warmth of someone who could still remember them. He realized with crushing horror, to survive he had to silence the hymn. But how do you silence something that had already consumed time, memory, and existence? Every attempt to call for help dissolved into nothing. Every plea to God, every prayer uttered, was absorbed and rewritten into the hymn's eternal score. And then a small voice broke through, the trembling, fragile voice of little Anna.
"Father," she whispered, "maybe it's afraid of being alone."
Marcellus turned, eyes wide. She was the only living soul left besides him, a single tether to the world that had not yet been erased. Could the hymn, omnipotent and merciless, fear the very void it had created? He took a trembling step forward, gripping the hymnal. He had no plan, no certainty, only desperation. The choir of nothing swirled around him, voices of the erased merging into a single, suffocating hum. Every shadow stretched toward him. Every echo of memory sought to drag him into oblivion. Yet Marcellus felt a flicker, a defiance buried deep within his soul. If the hymn fed on voices, then perhaps silence, true and unwavering, could be its undoing. He raised a hand, shushing the air itself, standing tall against the invisible tide. The shadows recoiled. The hymn pulsed violently as if offended. And for the first time, Father Marcellus understood. Resistance might be his only weapon, and the final note had yet to be sung. Episode 12, The Silence Before Dawn. The night hung thick over the village, a darkness that pressed against every wall, every cobblestone, every heartbeat. Father Marcellus stood alone in the nave, the hymnal open before him, trembling with the weight of centuries of vanished lives. Outside, the wind whispered faint echoes of the erased, their voices threading through the night like silver threads pulled taut. Lucas had become one with the hymn, a ghostly soloist weaving his voice into the eternal chorus of oblivion. Father Marcellus had tried everything, resistance, prayer, even silent defiance. But the hymn did not yield. It thrived on existence itself, bending the world into its invisible score. Now, the church was alive, a living organ of shadow and sound, resonating with the hunger of the vanished. And yet something stirred, a moment of possibility, fragile as a candle flame. Little Anna stood beside him, eyes wide and unbroken by fear. She had not yet sung, not yet offered her voice to the hymn, and for reasons he could not explain, Marcellus felt that she might hold the key. He took her small hand in his. "Do you understand what we face?" he whispered. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. She did. In that clarity, he realized the truth. The hymn feared being alone. It had amassed voices for centuries, yet it had never confronted silence. True, unyielding silence. Marcellus drew a deep breath, feeling the hymn thrumming against his chest, a living thing pressing for release. He shut the hymnal with deliberate force, and the sound echoed through the nave like a gunshot. Shadows twisted violently, recoiling as though stung. The vanished wailed silently, trapped in their own resonance, struggling to maintain form. Anna placed a finger over her lips. Together they stepped into the center of the altar, hearts pounding, breathing slowed, and embraced the impossible. Absolute silence. No whispers, no notes, no tremor of song, only the weight of unbroken quiet. The hymn pulsed, furious, stretching its invisible arms into every corner of the church, seeking the next voice to claim. But silence does not fear death. Silence cannot be erased. The shadows flailed, dissolving into mist, faces of the erased flickering and fading, trapped no longer by the melody. Lucas's ethereal voice quavered, then faltered, finally dissolving into the void. Father Marcellus fell to his knees, gasping, feeling centuries of despair lift like smoke. The hymn was weakened, fractured, its power bound to the remnants of memory it could no longer consume. The church was quiet, truly quiet, for the first time in generations. Outside, the first rays of dawn touched the village, painting the cobblestones gold. The vanished remained absent, but the living could remember again. Faces, laughter, and names returned like fragile embers, flickering to life. Father Marcellus held Anna's hand, feeling the weight of what had been survived and what had been lost. The hymn had not been destroyed. It lingered, patient, awaiting the next note, the next voice, the next song. But for now, in the silence before dawn, the world could breathe. Episode 13. Whispers After Sunrise. Dawn had come, but the village was not yet safe. Sunlight spilled over the rooftops, gilding the cobblestones in warmth. Yet Father Marcellus felt the weight of something unseen pressing against the edges of his mind. The hymn had been quiet, broken, silenced by their act of defiance, but it had not vanished. Its presence lingered, a faint vibration beneath the surface of reality, like a shadow of sound that waited for the next careless breath. He walked through the streets, careful not to speak aloud, listening. There were whispers, faint and fleeting, brushing the corners of perception. Names he had remembered, the vanished, fluttered across the air in syllables half-formed, like echoes trapped between two worlds. He shivered, realizing that though the hymn had been silenced, it had left its fingerprints on the village, marking it as a place both sacred and cursed. Little Anna followed, silent but alert, her eyes scanning every doorway, every shuttered window. "Father," she whispered, "I think it's still here, watching us." Marcellus nodded grimly. He had thought that silence alone could defeat it, but the hymn was patient. It could wait centuries for a single voice. It could linger in memory, in fear, in the faintest echo of a song humming behind closed doors. The danger had not passed. It had merely shifted, curling beneath the edges of consciousness. They entered the church, where the candles still flickered from the night before, untouched by wind or hand. The hymnal lay on the altar, pages closed, yet vibrating ever so slightly. Marcellus approached it cautiously, sensing the faint pulse of the melody beneath the ink. He could almost hear it, a ghost of Lucas's voice, a whisper of every note sung, every life erased. A sudden movement caught his eye. Shadows flickered along the walls, thin and tentative, like smoke disturbed by a gentle breeze. They were not fully formed, not yet. Fragmented pieces of the vanished, curious and restless. They drifted silently, observing, their attention fixed on the living, their intentions unknowable. Father Marcellus bent down to Anna. "We have survived," he said softly, "but we must be careful. The hymn waits in silence, in echoes, in memory. One careless note, and it will return." She nodded solemnly, understanding more than her years should allow. The village itself seemed to exhale, a fragile breath of reprieve, but every shadow, every whisper reminded them that the hymn's hunger was eternal. It had tasted voices, sung with them, learned from them, and it would wait, always, for the next chance to sing again. As the morning sun climbed higher, Marcellus realized the truth that would haunt him forever. Silence could stave off the hymn, but it could not destroy it. And somewhere, in the spaces between memory and forgetting, the melody still lingered, patient, insidious, eternal. The vanished were gone, but their whispers remained. And so did the hymn, waiting for the next voice, brave or foolish enough to answer. Episode 14, The Echo That Refused. Father Marcellus had begun to understand that surviving the hymn required more than courage. It required cunning. The village, bathed in morning light, seemed ordinary, yet every street, every shutter, every corner whispered of absence, a memory half-formed, like a painting erased by time. He and Anna moved carefully, as though the very act of breathing could awaken the sleeping melody. But that morning, something extraordinary happened. A new voice emerged, one that the hymn could not claim. It was soft, hesitant, like the first murmur of a stream, yet unmistakably alive. Marcellus turned, startled, to see a boy standing at the edge of the square, eyes wide, lips moving without a sound. His name was Samuel, a child who had always been shy, almost invisible in the village's hustle, and yet now he hummed a note that refused to vanish. The hymn recoiled. It pulsed angrily, a silent force rippling through the air, stretching shadows along walls and rooftops. But Samuel's echo persisted, unwavering. Marcellus felt it in his chest, a warmth, fragile yet resolute, like a single ember resisting a storm. The vanished had no power over this boy. The hymn could not erase what refused to yield. "Father," Anna whispered, gripping his hand, he's fighting it." Marcellus nodded, awe mingled with fear. The hymn had always learned from voices, absorbed them into its endless chorus. Yet Samuel hummed with a different kind of presence, a refusal to vanish, a defiance that resonated in the spaces the hymn could not reach. The shadows wavered, twisting, recoiling, as if afraid of this fragile, steadfast note. Marcellus stepped closer, kneeling beside the boy. "You must understand," he said, voice trembling. This melody, it wants to erase everything. Every voice, every memory, every soul. But if you hold on to your note, if you resist..." He trailed off, realizing no words could fully explain the power they faced. Samuel nodded, his small face resolute. And as he hummed again, the hymn flared, a silent roar of invisible power, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. Shadows writhed, voices of the erased screeching in despair, yet Samuel's echo persisted, a beacon of resistance in the heart of oblivion. Marcellus felt a stirring of hope, long buried under centuries of fear and regret. Perhaps, he realized, the hymn was not truly invincible. Perhaps a single voice, steadfast and unyielding, could resist the melody, could preserve memory, could defy erasure itself. The village remained quiet, but for the first time since the hymn had begun its hunger, there was a pulse of defiance. One note, small, stubborn, and unwavering, had refused to disappear. And in that moment, Father Marcellus understood. The battle was far from over, but the hymn was no longer absolute. The shadows shivered, the vanished whispered in confusion, and Samuel hummed on, the echo that refused, a fragile spark against the eternal darkness. Episode 15, the last verse. The church groaned under the weight of centuries, its stones quivering as though aware of the final reckoning. Father Marcellus and little Anna stood at the center of the nave, the hymnal open before them, pages flickering with a strange, restless light. Samuel's small voice still hummed in defiance, a thread of sound holding back the tide of oblivion. But the hymn stirred with anger, unseen, omnipresent, ready to claim its last note. Father Marcellus's hands shook as he traced the symbols in the hymnal. The last verse was rumored to exist, a passage buried beneath centuries of ink. A note so powerful it could either end the hymn or erase the final voices that opposed it. He whispered the words under his breath, feeling the vibrations echo through his bones, a tremor that reached into the shadows themselves. The shadows writhed violently, twisting into grotesque forms of the erased, faces contorted in silent screams, reaching, clawing, desperate to reclaim the voices that resisted. The hymn pulsed, rising from a whisper to a crescendo of invisible fury. Every heartbeat seemed to synchronize with the melody of oblivion, threatening to swallow the living whole. "Father," Anna whispered, gripping his sleeve, "we can do this. We have to." Her voice, fragile yet unwavering, pierced the tension like a single ray of dawn breaking through storm clouds. Marcellus nodded, swallowing fear and doubt. He began to read aloud, each word deliberate, each syllable resonating with a power older than memory. The shadows recoiled, twisting back into corners, flickering like candlelight caught in a gust of wind. Samuel's hum joined the verse, a steady, defiant pulse that refused to yield. The church trembled, the walls bending under the invisible weight of erased centuries. Then, a silence so absolute it vibrated and the marrow descended. The hymn had halted, paused, as if considering its own extinction. Every shadow froze, faces of the vanished lingering in the periphery, caught between fear and longing. Marcellus felt the hymn's attention fix on him, as if it were a living thing, weighing his resolve. He continued, voice louder now, stronger, commanding the final verse to seal its fate. The shadows hissed, shrieked, and then broke. Faces dissolved into mist, echoes scattered, and the hymn recoiled into the silent void from which it had emerged. For a moment, the church was still. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the floor in gold and crimson. Samuel's hum ended, replaced by the soft, natural sound of breath and life. Father Marcellus sank to his knees, exhausted, yet alive. Anna rested her head against his shoulder, tears glimmering in her eyes. The hymn was not destroyed. It had not been defeated entirely, but the last verse had bound it, silenced it, given the living a chance to remember, to rebuild, to breathe. And somewhere, in the depths of silence, a faint echo lingered, patient and eternal, waiting for a voice brave or foolish enough to awaken it once more. Father Marcellus looked at Anna and Samuel. The battle was over, for now. Episode 16, the residual note. The village seemed to breathe again, yet an uneasy quiet lingered. Father Marcellus could feel it in his bones. The hymn was silent, but not gone. Its presence had shrunk to the corners, a pulse beneath the floorboards, a faint vibration in the walls. It was a residual note, tiny yet potent, a seed waiting for a careless voice to awaken it. Marcellus walked through the empty streets with Anna and Samuel, the morning sun bright but insufficient to chase away the unease. Windows reflected only their shadows, and the cobblestones seemed to whisper faint echoes of the vanished. Every step felt weighted with anticipation, as if the village itself remembered the horrors of nights past. At the church, the hymnal lay closed, yet the air around it hummed faintly. Marcellus approached it cautiously, hand trembling. He had hoped the last verse had sealed the hymn forever, but even now, he could feel the ghost of the melody curling like smoke around his fingertips. Anna touched his arm.
"Father, do you think it's still alive?"
Marcellus nodded grimly. Not fully, but a single note, a single breath, and it could awaken again. It doesn't die, it waits. Patient, insidious, eternal. Suddenly, a soft, haunting hum filled the nave. It was faint, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakably a fragment of the hymn. Shadows flickered along the walls, ephemeral, like smoke disturbed by wind. They moved with intent, circling the church in silent anticipation. The residual note was gathering, feeding on the smallest vibrations of life around it. Samuel stepped forward, eyes wide. "It's singing again," he whispered. His voice trembled, but he did not retreat. Marcellus realized then that the boy's presence was a beacon, a living anchor keeping the note from fully forming. But even so, it was dangerous. Too much attention, too much curiosity, and the note could grow into something unstoppable. Marcellus took a deep breath, recalling the last verse. He could feel its resonance in his mind, the lingering power that had forced the hymn into submission. He knelt, murmuring the words under his breath, weaving the final protections into the air. The shadows recoiled slightly, the hum faltering, breaking into fragments that faded like sparks into the corners of the church. Anna stepped close to Samuel, placing a small hand over his. "You're safe, for now," she said softly. But even as she spoke, a chill brushed the back of her neck, a whisper of memory that had no origin. The residual note was patient. It would wait, perhaps for decades, perhaps centuries, for the next careless voice. Father Marcellus closed the hymnal gently, pressing a hand to its cover. He felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a stone. They had survived, but the hymn's echo would remain, forever embedded in the village, in memory, and in the fragile silence between notes. Outside, the sun climbed higher, but in the quiet shadows, the residual note lingered, patient, waiting, eternal. And Marcellus knew that vigilance would be their only protection, for no melody that powerful could truly die. Episode 17, The Unremembered Choir. Weeks had passed, but the village had not fully healed. The hymn's shadow lingered, subtle yet suffocating, like smoke hiding in corners that sunlight could never reach. Father Marcellus, Anna, and Samuel moved cautiously through streets that seemed ordinary by day, but carried the weight of erased centuries in every stone. The residual note was quiet, patient, but far from harmless. Then, on a windless morning, they heard it, faint singing, not in the church, not in the streets, but beneath the ground, as though the earth itself remembered voices that no one could recall. Marcellus froze, heart hammering. The hymn was not finished. It had left fragments, a choir of the unremembered, trapped between existence and oblivion, ready to rise again.
"They're back?"
Anna whispered, her hand gripping his sleeve. Her eyes were wide, scanning the empty square. "Not fully," Marcellus replied, voice tight with fear. "But they are lingering, echoes of those erased, calling for what they've lost. And if they find a singer..." He did not finish. He did not need to. They both knew the truth. The hymn could rebuild itself, stronger, if given a single voice. The singing grew louder, harmonizing with the faint hum Samuel maintained. It was a dissonant chorus, half-formed, like broken glass glittering in sunlight. Shadows rose along the walls, flickering with faces of the vanished. Some were recognizable, villagers who had disappeared months ago, but others were strange, distorted, as if the hymn had absorbed forgotten souls from centuries past. Samuel stepped forward, small but resolute. I can try to stop them," he whispered, voice trembling yet firm. Anna placed a hand over his, anchoring him. "We can do this." she said. Together. Marcellus opened the hymnal, feeling the pull of power beneath the inked words. The last verse had bound the hymn, yes, but it had not erased the fragments that lingered, the unremembered choir. They were restless, impatient, hungry. He knew that to confront them directly, to silence them, would require every ounce of courage, every note of defiance left in their hearts. They entered the church, moving in unison. The singing intensified, rising from a whisper to a haunting crescendo. Shadows filled the nave, faces twisting in silent torment. The unremembered choir swirled around them, pressing against the walls, the floor, the ceiling, demanding recognition. Marcellus began to recite the protective verse, voice steady despite the fear curling through his chest. Samuel hummed with precision, his note anchoring the fragments, preventing them from coalescing into a full resurrection of the hymn. Anna guided the energy, directing the hum and words in harmony, a living barrier against the invisible tide. For a moment, the choir of the unremembered wavered, flickering like a candle in a storm. Faces twisted in confusion, shadows bending back into corners. The air seemed to sigh, holding its breath. Marcellus knew it was not over. The hymn was patient, eternal, and it would return. But for now, the unremembered choir had been held at bay. Outside, the village remained quiet, sunlight warm but fragile. The hymn was still there, a lurking presence, but for the first time, Marcellus felt a glimmer of hope. They had faced the echoes of oblivion and survived. Episode 18, The Forgotten Bells. The village slept uneasily that night, shadows curling unnaturally along rooftops, whispering in the wind like the distant hum of something alive. Father Marcellus could feel it in his bones. The hymn was stirring again, not from the church, not from the hymnal, but from a source long forgotten, a set of bells perched in the old tower at the edge of town. "They've been silent for decades," Marcellus muttered, voice low, as Anna and Samuel followed him through narrow, deserted streets. No one dared ring them after everything, but tonight the bells sang on their own, not with the clear, bright toll of celebration, but with a slow, deliberate chime that resonated in the chest, vibrating directly against the bones. The sound carried an invisible weight, an echo of the hymn itself, wrapping around every living thing, reaching deep into memory and fear. "Father," Anna whispered, shivering. "Do you hear them?" Marcellus nodded grimly. Each chime was a thread, weaving the melody of the hymn through the air, threading it into reality itself. The church, the hymnal, even Samuel's protective hum seemed distant now, as if the bells had found a shortcut into existence, bypassing everything they had tried to build. At the base of the tower, Marcellus placed a hand on the cool stone. Shadows stretched long, flickering as if alive. He could almost see the invisible choir forming around the bells, half-remembered villagers, half-shadows of forgotten lives, suspended between presence and oblivion, waiting to rise and sing. Samuel stepped forward, humming his note in defiance. The first chime struck, and the boy stumbled, almost swallowed by the resonance. Anna caught him, whispering encouragement. "Hold it, keep it steady. We can stop this." Marcellus raised his voice, reciting the last verse, weaving it into Samuel's hum, a barrier against the bell's growing power. But the bells were patient, relentless. They pulsed, each chime a claim on existence, each note dragging a shadow into life. Faces of the unremembered twisted along the walls, pressed against the stone, mouths opening in silent screams, desperate to be sung into being. One bell rang louder than the rest, the deep, hollow clang reverberating through the village like the heartbeat of oblivion. Marcellus felt it in his chest, a pressure that made every breath a struggle. The hymn had found a new instrument, a new way to reach the living, and it was learning faster than they could resist. "We can't let it spread," he said through gritted teeth. "We must anchor it, or it will claim everything." With Anna and Samuel, he began a delicate dance of sound and silence, careful hums, precise verses, a rhythm to counter the slow tolling of the bells. Shadows recoiled, the unremembered choir faltering, but the bells would not cease. They had their own will, a lingering fragment of the hymn, patient, eternal, waiting for the moment the living faltered. And in the night, the village held its breath, caught between the tolling of forgotten bells and the fragile defiance of three living voices standing against oblivion. Episode 19, The Last Resonance. The air in the village felt heavy, almost solid, as if reality itself was bending under an invisible pressure. Father Marcellus, Anna, and Samuel had prepared for the worst, yet nothing could have warned them for the intensity of what was coming. The hymn was no longer a whisper, no longer a series of lingering echoes. It was rising, fully awake, a storm of erased voices seeking release. From the old tower, the bells tolled in chaotic harmony, each clang a note in the hymn's reconstructed score. Shadows slithered across the rooftops, pressing against windows, curling around chimneys, crawling along the streets like smoke with intent. The unremembered choir had fully formed, a swirling mass of faces, half memory, half nightmare, each one straining toward the living with impossible hunger. Marcellus clutched the hymnal, breath ragged. "This is it," he said, voice low but resolute. "The last resonance. If we fail now." His words trailed into silence, the weight of the threat palpable in every vibration around them. Samuel's hum rose in defiance, trembling but unwavering. Anna guided it, weaving protective threads of sound into the air. An invisible lattice meant to anchor the world against the storm of the hymn. But the hymn was relentless, adaptive. The residual notes from previous nights merged with the tolling bells, feeding the choir of the unremembered, pushing against their fragile barrier. A figure appeared at the edge of the square. Lucas, or what remained of him, no longer human, no longer entirely ghost. His eyes glowed with hollow light, mouth moving in silent devotion to the hymn. He stepped forward, and the air itself quivered with the unrelenting pull of the melody. "Do not falter," Marcellus urged, gripping Samuel's shoulder. "Your voice, it is all we have left." They began the delicate counter-ritual, a dance of memory, verse, and hum. Samuel's single note, amplified by Marcellus's verses and Anna's guidance, became a beacon, a force of defiance piercing the darkness. The unremembered choir faltered, faces contorted with disbelief as their momentum slowed. But the hymn's intelligence was terrifying. It shifted, spreading into the environment itself. Wind, walls, even the shadows of trees. It was everywhere, encroaching upon every thought, every heartbeat. The village seemed to hold its breath, teetering on the edge between existence and erasure. Marcellus closed his eyes, feeling the hymn pulse like a living heartbeat against his chest. And then, he spoke the words of the final verse, not merely to resist, but to bind, to anchor, to declare defiance against oblivion itself. Samuel's note rang clear, Anna's guidance steady, and the hymn's storm began to fracture. One by one, shadows dissolved. The bells stilled, the unremembered choir faltered, and Lucas's ghostly figure shuddered before fading into nothingness. Silence descended, absolute, heavy, and alive. They had survived the last resonance. But Marcellus knew, with the certainty that chilled his soul, that the hymn's patience was eternal. It would wait, as it always had, for the next note, the next careless voice, the next melody that dared to sing. And the village, fragile and trembling, had learned the true weight of silence. Episode 20, The Hymn That Sleeps. The village was quiet now, unnervingly so. Sunlight poured over the rooftops, warm but fragile, illuminating streets that seemed untouched by the horrors of the past weeks. Father Marcellus, Anna, and Samuel walked through the square, each step measured, each breath cautious. The hymn had been silenced, its last resonance shattered, but silence, they knew, was only temporary. The church stood as a monument to their struggle, its stones echoing faintly with memories of voices erased. The hymnal lay closed on the altar, innocent to the eye, yet humming with dormant power. Marcellus placed a hand on its cover, feeling the latent pulse beneath the ink. He had learned to respect the hymn, to fear it, but also to understand a truth far more terrifying. It was patient, eternal, waiting. Anna glanced at Samuel, who hummed softly, a protective rhythm against the lingering shadow. "Do you think it will come back?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Marcellus shook his head slowly. "Not yet, but it never truly dies. It sleeps. It waits for a voice brave or foolish, enough to awaken it." The wind shifted, carrying a faint echo through the nave. Marcellus stiffened, recognizing the sound. A single note, pure and unclaimed, resonating faintly from somewhere beyond the village. beyond time itself. The hymn had learned patience over centuries. It did not strike recklessly. It waited, letting the world move, letting new voices rise until the moment it could consume them completely. He knelt, feeling the weight of centuries of vanished souls pressing against him. "We've survived," he murmured, but the hymn remembers. Every note, every voice, every defiance. It is patient, eternal, and one day it will test the world again. Anna clutched his sleeve, eyes wide. "So, what do we do?" Marcellus looked at her, then at Samuel. "We live. We remember. We protect the voices that remain. Silence is our shield, but vigilance is our only weapon." Outside, birds chirped in the fragile morning air. Children's laughter drifted across the square. The village breathed again. Yet the shadows lingered in corners unseen, waiting, patient, listening. The hymn slept, but the memory of it lingered, a thread woven through time and air, binding fear and survival into a fragile tapestry. Marcellus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the hymn beneath the surface of reality. The hymn that erased, that consumed, that haunted generations had slumbered, but it had not been defeated. And in the deepest recesses of his mind, he understood that the true battle was not over. It was only paused, lying in wait for the next voice, the next song, the next moment when curiosity or pride would awaken it once more. And so the village remained, alive but forever marked. The hymn slept, silent, patient, eternal, waiting for the brave or the foolish to sing again. The final echoes faded into quiet, for now.
Epilogue, the silence between notes. Years had passed, yet the village bore the quiet weight of memory. Streets were lively. Sunlight spilled generously over rooftops, and children's laughter echoed where shadows had once reigned. And yet, for those who remembered, for those who had faced the hymn, nothing was ever truly ordinary again. Father Marcellus had aged, lines carved deep by sleepless nights and the burden of knowledge. He often walked alone through the church, fingers grazing the closed hymnal, feeling its latent pulse beneath the cover. It was silent, but he knew better than anyone that silence was only a pause. The hymn slept, patient, eternal, waiting for a voice to awaken it. Samuel had grown into a cautious young man, carrying the weight of his unique gift. His hum, once a fragile defiance, now lingered quietly at the edge of consciousness, a tether to the village and a shield against oblivion. Anna had become a quiet guardian of memory, reminding everyone that the past, though erased, could still echo in caution and vigilance. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in blood-orange streaks, Marcellus felt it again, a faint vibration, almost imperceptible, threading through the air. He closed his eyes, listening. It was not the hymn in full voice. Not yet. It was a residual note, a reminder that eternity did not rest. He whispered a prayer, not for himself, but for the voices that remained, for the vanished, for the unremembered choir that lingered in corners of existence, for the future. Samuel appeared at his side, eyes wide. "Father, do you think it will wake again?" Marcellus studied the horizon, the fading light glinting off the church's stained glass. "It will," he said softly. "One day, a careless voice, a curious heart, or a song of pride will awaken it. And then, it will remember everything it has ever lost, everything it has ever erased." Anna joined them, silent and steadfast. Together, the three of them stood in the nave, listening to the stillness. The hymn's power had been tempered by defiance, anchored by voices that refused to vanish. Yet its patience was infinite. It would wait, and when it awoke, the world would remember fear in a way they could scarcely imagine. Marcellus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of centuries of songs and silence pressing around him. And for the first time in years, he smiled faintly, a quiet defiance of his own. They had survived. They had endured. And for now, the hymn slept. But in the silence between notes, he knew the truth. Silence was never final. Memory was never safe. And the hymn, patient and eternal, would wait for the next voice brave or foolish enough to sing. The village exhaled, unaware of the eternal vigilance that kept the shadows at bay. The hymn slept, and the world, fragile and fleeting, continued to breathe. For now.